In this video, we're going to talk about how the autonomic nervous system works. So the autonomic nervous system is a branch of the efferent nervous system. So these are neurons that exit the central nervous system and control largely involuntary functions. So the autonomic nervous system is split into two branches. So ANS is the abbreviation for autonomic nervous system. So we have the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch. And generally, you are balanced between output from both of these branches. So if you are, say, resting, well fed, then you are largely parasympathetic. And if you are, for example, exercising or in an emergency situation, then the sympathetic branch is dominant. So I'm going to put exercising, emergency. And generally, like I said before, you're usually balanced between the two. You're rarely completely sympathetic, which would be kind of like a panic attack, or rarely completely parasympathetic. So the arrangement of the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons is a little bit unusual. They both originate from the central nervous system. So actually, let me label the branches of the autonomic nervous system here. So the blue branch, and this is matching the color coding in your book, is parasympathetic, and the red branch is our sympathetic branch. So these originate in the spinal cord, and they are influenced by stimuli coming from the central nervous system. So, for example, the hypothalamus, maybe if there's low blood pressure detected, the areas of the brainstem and the limbic system. So emotions can influence autonomic output. So let me put limbic system here, and some spinal reflexes as well. I'll just put spinal reflexes. So lots of different stimuli originating mostly in your brain can influence the autonomic nervous system output. So you'll notice that we have the autonomic neurons arranged in pairs with the parasympathetic branch and the sympathetic branch, and we've put on there a target tissue, which is the heart, which is shown in pink. So the area where the first set of neurons synapse with the second pair of neurons is called the ganglion. So let me draw a circle around here. This is the ganglion. A ganglion is just a collection of synapses anatomically. So we can call the neurons that come before the ganglion the preganglionic neurons, and the neurons that come after the ganglion the postganglionic neurons. So I'll put preganglionic neurons and postganglionic. So let's look first at the neurons that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So we have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. And of course, where they communicate with each other in the ganglion is a synapse. And so the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron is going to release some neurotransmitter, which I'll put in here. And this neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And I will put ACH equals acetylcholine, which of course has to bind with acetylcholine receptors on what we call the postganglionic membrane. So I'll just make these blue triangles, and I will label these as ACH R for ACH receptors. And these are referred to as cholinergic receptors. And in fact, specifically, these are nicotinic cholinergic receptors. There's different kinds of cholinergic receptors. Nicotinic cholinergic receptors. And so when acetylcholine released from this preganglionic neuron binds with receptors on the postganglionic neuron, we get graded potentials and action potentials. And then the postganglionic neuron also releases neurotransmitters. And it turns out that the postganglionic neuron of the parasympathetic nervous system also releases acetylcholine. And in order for the heart to respond to acetylcholine, it also has to have cholinergic receptors. And I'm going to draw an open triangle for these because these are called muscarinic cholinergic receptors. This is a different type. So it's a muscarinic cholinergic. I'm going to abbreviate cholinergic. And when acetylcholine binds with receptors on the heart, we get a decrease in heart rate. So remember we talked about antagonistic control of the heart some time ago. Okay, let's look at the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic branch has a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron as well. And it turns out that the preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic branch also releases acetylcholine. And these postganglionic neurons have receptors, the same kind, these nicotinic muscarinic receptors as well. And when acetylcholine binds with the receptors on the postganglionic neuron, we get graded potentials and action potentials. And then the postganglionic neuron releases a different neurotransmitter. It releases norepinephrine, Ne equals norepinephrine. So now we have a different receptor to be concerned about, and epinephrine and norepinephrine bind with adrenergic receptors on the heart. So let's draw some red squares for our adrenergic receptors. And we've already talked a little bit about the difference between beta adrenergic and alpha adrenergic receptors, and it turns out that the ones on the heart are beta adrenergic receptors. So we have an increase in heart rate when norepinephrine binds with these receptors on the heart. We can also get epinephrine coming from the adrenal glands, which will also bind with these receptors and increase heart rate. So you could draw epinephrine. So maybe we could do this over here. So here's some blood that has epinephrine in it that came from, that says epi, that came from the adrenal gland, and it can travel and bind with adrenergic receptors. So the epi is from the adrenal gland. I'm running out of space. Okay, a couple things that we need to point out is we have a couple of different synapses here. We've got a synapse between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron, and we have a synapse between the postganglionic neuron and the target tissue, which in this case is the heart. And so we need to make sure we're clear about what's going on at the synapse. So actually I need to put an arrow there for the receptor. So the membrane that releases neurotransmitters is called the presynaptic membrane because it comes before the synapse. And the membrane that has receptors for the neurotransmitter is called the postsynaptic membrane. So here is a presynaptic membrane. And we have another presynaptic membrane over here. That's also a presynaptic membrane. The postsynaptic membranes are the ones that have the receptors. So let me write postsynaptic membrane. So here is a postsynaptic membrane. Here is a postsynaptic membrane. And the target tissue here is the postsynaptic membrane at this synapse. So I'll put an arrow going to the heart. So that's also a postsynaptic membrane because it has receptors for the neurotransmitter. So you could get a question that would say, what kind of receptors does the postsynaptic membrane of the postganglionic neuron have in the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system? So the postganglionic neuron is this one because it's the second one in the pathway, and the presynaptic membrane of that, or the postsynaptic membrane rather, would be this membrane right here. The presynaptic membrane of this neuron is where it's releasing the neurotransmitters. The postsynaptic membrane is where it has receptors. So if we looked at the postganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic nervous system, then for this neuron, its postsynaptic membrane is this one here with the acetylcholine receptors, and its presynaptic membrane releases acetylcholine. So the best way to learn this is to draw it and label it over and over. And when you get a question about it on a quiz, quickly draw some little stick neurons and label your preganglionic neurons, which is this pair here, your postganglionic neurons, which is this pair here, and then you won't get your terminology all confused. Hopefully this makes the structure and function of the autonomic nervous system fairly clear. I would recommend reading all of chapter 11. If any of the chapters you need to read the whole way through, chapter 11 is one of them. And it has a really nice figure at the end of it that you should take a look at. So draw this. You have a notes template. Do it over and over and over again until you can label it just like this without looking at your notes, because we will be talking about the autonomic nervous system for the entire semester.